There are moments in the history of psychology, moments when a seemingly minor case, a single thread in the fabric of human experience, suddenly reveals itself as a gateway to something vast, timeless, and deeply mysterious. Such is the case of the Miller Fantasies, an inner drama carefully observed and analyzed by Carl Gustav Jung in his great work, Symbols of Transformation. First, it seems so simple. A young woman, whom Jung refers to as Miss Miller, begins to record her inner visions. She appears on the surface as an ordinary person, living an ordinary life. But beneath that surface, her imagination stirs with powerful images. Her mind becomes filled with symbolic dramas, fantasies that rise with an intensity too great to dismiss as daydreams. In these fantasies, something ancient breathes. Archetypes awaken, and universal patterns unfold. Jung was fascinated by this, because when the imagination of one individual gives birth to images of such depth, they are rarely confined to the personal sphere. They are reflections of something greater, of the collective unconscious itself, that hidden treasury of symbols, which unites humanity across cultures and ages. Miss Miller describes these experiences as though she were drifting, half in a dream, half in waking reality. Her visions are not deliberate inventions. They seem to come of their own accord, as if guided by an unseen force. In one striking fantasy, she imagines herself as a bird, a winged being soaring high above the earth, leaving behind the heaviness of the everyday world. The bird, Jung explains, is not merely an idle picture. It is an archetype, an ancient symbol of the soul. It speaks of the human longing to rise, to seek freedom, to enter the realm of spirit and light. Yet every ascent carries danger. The higher one flies, the greater the risk of falling. And so Miss Miller feels the pull of two worlds, her yearning for the spiritual heights, and the gravity of material existence below. This tension, this struggle between above and below, is one of the earliest signs that her fantasies reveal more than personal dreams. They mirror the eternal drama of the human soul. Jung does not regard these images as meaningless. To him, they are a form of anamnesis, a remembering, not the memory of personal events, but of something far deeper, the hidden archetypal memories that live in the unconscious. The word anamnesis itself takes us back to Plato. Plato taught that true knowledge is not gained from outside, but is a recollection, a remembering of eternal truths, already embedded within the soul. Thus, Jung suggests, the Miller fantasies are not accidents. They are the psyche's way of recalling its own ancient roots. Even in an ordinary individual, the depths of humanity are alive, waiting to break through. As her fantasies deepen, Miss Miller encounters entire scenes of myth. Heroes appear before her, battles unfold, gods themselves seem to rise and fall within her visions. Here Jung recognizes something remarkable. These are not inventions of her conscious mind. They belong to a much older layer of experience, the archaic consciousness of humankind. It is the inheritance of the species, a level of psyche where myth and reality are not yet divided. In this archaic realm, symbols live and move with their own vitality. They shape the drama of the inner world. Now Jung stresses something important. Miss Miller is not ill. Her visions are not symptoms of psychosis. Rather, they are the natural expression of the unconscious, seeking form and voice. This is what makes her case so precious. It shows us that the unconscious, when allowed to speak, can generate entire mythologies, powerful, moving, transformative dramas, from within the soul of an ordinary human being. One of the central motifs she encounters is the theme of sacrifice. She envisions ritual scenes, acts of offering and death, shadowed by the promise of renewal. To Jung, this is no coincidence. He recognizes here the timeless pattern of sacrificial death and rebirth. It echoes the myths of dying gods, Osiris, Dionysus, Christ, figures who fall into death, only to rise again. In her fantasies, Miss Miller undergoes this pattern herself. A part of her must perish, so that another part, greater, wiser, more whole, may come alive. This is the path of transformation. It is the drama of the psyche, played out not in outer events, but in the theater of the inner world. Thus, even in the early stages of analysis, Jung perceives the great significance of her visions. They are not pathological illusions, they are revelations. They are the soul's way of remembering its ancient stories, and of carrying the individual toward change. Through these symbols, through birds that rise, through sacrifices that renew, the psyche whispers its old wisdom, and this wisdom leads step by step toward transformation. As Miss Miller's inner journey continues, her visions begin to grow more dramatic and more symbolic. What began as scattered images, a bird rising, a fleeting picture of sacrifice, now expands into entire worlds. She describes battles between figures, clashes of forces, as if her soul had stepped onto a vast mythological stage. These are not simple daydreams. They carry the structure of myth itself. The symbols rise with their own life and intensity, as if ancient stories long forgotten are being reenacted within her imagination. Jung points out that such fantasies reveal a timeless drama, the conflict of opposites, light and darkness, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter, life and death. These are not just abstract concepts. They are living forces in the psyche, constantly moving against one another, seeking balance, yet never without tension. In Miss Miller's fantasies, this struggle becomes visible. It is as though her unconscious is staging a play, a cosmic drama in miniature, through which she must find her own meaning. One vision shows her surrounded by darkness, but in that darkness a flame appears. It flickers, fragile, yet persistent. The flame is the spark of consciousness, the light that refuses to be extinguished, even when surrounded by the unknown. Here Jung sees an archetype, the eternal symbol of the light-bringer, the Promethean fire, the divine spark within the human soul. The flame carries hope, but also danger. For every illumination threatens to burn too brightly, to consume, to overwhelm, if not balanced with wisdom. Another recurring theme in her visions is the encounter between male and female figures. They appear as lovers, as opponents, sometimes as divine beings, sometimes as shadowy doubles. Jung interprets this as the archetypal polarity of the animus and anima, the masculine within the feminine soul, and the feminine within the masculine soul. In Miss Miller's fantasies, these forces do not always harmonize. They clash, they resist, yet their struggle is necessary, for only through the meeting of opposites can transformation occur. Jung emphasizes that myths across cultures have always portrayed this duality, the god of light and the god of darkness, the hero and his shadow, the mother goddess who nurtures, yet also devours. These are not inventions of one culture or another. They are archetypes, structures of the human soul. And now, in the fantasies of one young woman, these ancient structures come alive once more, reminding us that mythology is not a dead memory of the past, but a living presence in the unconscious. At times, Miss Miller describes herself caught between two opposing forces. One pulls her upward, toward transcendence, spirit, liberation. The other draws her downward, into matter, instinct, and the weight of the earth. This is not merely her struggle, it is the human struggle itself. Jung notes that many myths portray this same polarity, the ascent to heaven and the descent to the underworld, the hero torn between divine destiny and earthly chains. Miss Miller's soul enacts the very drama that countless myths have carried through the ages. One particularly striking motif in her fantasies is the presence of death. She imagines scenes where life is extinguished, where figures fall into darkness, where endings seem final and absolute. From these scenes of death, there emerges a hidden promise, renewal, resurrection. the birth of something new. This cycle of death and rebirth is central to Jung's interpretation. It is the archetypal process of transformation. The old self must die. The old patterns must dissolve, so that a greater wholeness can come into being. Thus, what seems like despair in her visions is, in truth, the prelude to change. Jung reminds us here that the unconscious often speaks in paradox. The same image can carry both terror and hope, death and life, destruction and creation. For the psyche, opposites are never truly separate. They circle one another. They mirror one another. They belong to a greater unity that the conscious mind struggles to grasp. Miss Miller's fantasies embody this paradox. Her soul is showing her, in image after image, that transformation always comes through tension, through struggle, through the meeting of opposites. And so, part 2 of her story is not simply about images of myth. It is about the revelation of a deeper law, that the human soul lives in polarity, and only by engaging that polarity can it move toward wholeness. As the inner drama of Miss Miller unfolds, a new pattern begins to emerge. It is the pattern of the hero's journey, a timeless story that has echoed through myths, legends, and sacred texts across the world. The young woman, through her fantasies, enters the path of descent. She finds herself drawn into shadowy realms, worlds of trial and transformation. This descent is not a fall into madness. It is the archetypal journey that every hero, every seeker must take. To descend is to face the unknown, to enter the underworld of the psyche, where old certainties dissolve and hidden powers stir. Jung emphasizes that myths across cultures describe this same pattern. The hero leaves the familiar world, crosses into darkness, faces danger, temptation, and encounters figures of both terror and wisdom. So it is with Miss Miller. Her visions place her in landscapes of trial. Sometimes she is pursued, sometimes she is tested, sometimes she feels utterly alone. But within each vision lies a symbolic task. The soul is teaching her, through images and dramas, how transformation requires courage, patience, and endurance. In one of her fantasies, she feels herself sinking beneath the earth. The ground gives way, and she is swallowed into darkness. This is the motif of the catabasis, the descent into the underworld. It is the path of Orpheus, of Persephone, of Christ's harrowing of hell. The underworld is terrifying, but it is also sacred. For only there, in the depths, can the seeds of rebirth be found. Jung explains that such images are not random. They reflect the psyche's need to let go of the old self, to die symbolically, before renewal can take place. Miss Miller, through her visions, is undergoing precisely this process. Her descent is not an error. It is a necessity. For the path to individuation, the path to wholeness, always leads through the shadow, through the confrontation with darkness. Another motif that arises in her fantasies is that of the guide, a figure who appears at the moment of greatest uncertainty. Sometimes it is a wise man, sometimes a radiant figure, sometimes a voice that speaks from within. This guide, Jung notes, is an expression of the archetype of the self, the deeper totality of the psyche, which appears in symbolic form to lead the ego through its trials. The presence of a guide means that the unconscious is not only destructive, it also contains wisdom, direction, a hidden intelligence that seeks the growth of the soul. But no guide can spare the hero from struggle. Miss Miller's path is filled with challenges, tests of endurance, encounters with fearsome images, scenes of death and rebirth. In myth, these trials are always necessary. Hercules must labor. Odysseus must wander. Christ must bear the cross. The psyche too requires trial, for it is through struggle that strength and awareness are forged. At moments, Miss Miller's fantasies show her standing before gates, barriers she cannot pass without change. These gates symbolize thresholds. To cross them means leaving behind the old patterns of thought, the narrow limitations of the ego, and entering a larger world of being. Thresholds are always frightening, because they demand surrender. Yet they are also sacred, for they are the doorway to transformation. Jung observes that the Miller Fantasies reveal the psyche's deep knowledge of this heroic pattern. The descent, the trials, the guides, the thresholds, all are stages of the individuation process. Individuation, Jung reminds us, is the journey of becoming whole. It is the integration of the conscious and the unconscious, the union of opposites, the birth of the self. Miss Miller may not know this consciously, but her soul is already moving along this path. Her fantasies reveal it symbolically, as if myth itself were speaking through her. Thus, part 3 of her story shows us the archetype of the hero's journey, the descent into shadow, the confrontation with trials, the presence of guiding figures, and the slow movement toward transformation. It is a reminder that the myths we read in books, the stories told in ancient temples, are not distant fictions. They are maps of the inner world, alive within the unconscious of every human being. And through Miss Miller's fantasies, we see how the timeless hero's journey can emerge in the life of one seemingly ordinary soul. As the visions of Miss Miller unfold even further, a new rhythm begins to appear. The darkness of descent, the pain of trial, slowly gives way to something else, the promise of renewal. Jung notices that again and again, her fantasies return to images of rebirth. She sees new beginnings rising out of endings, light emerging from shadow, life springing out of death. These images, he explains, are not accidental. They are archetypal. They represent the deep law of the psyche, that transformation is born out of opposition, and that destruction is always paired with creation. One of the most striking patterns in her inner world is the union of opposites. She imagines forces that once fought against each other, slowly moving toward reconciliation. Male and female, light and dark, above and below. These polarities no longer stand apart, locked in eternal battle. Instead, her soul begins to sense that wholeness requires their union, their embrace, their sacred marriage. Jung calls this union of opposites the coniunctio, a term drawn from the old alchemical texts. The alchemists spoke of the mystical wedding, the merging of king and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. For them, it symbolized not only the transformation of metals, but the transformation of the soul itself. In Miss Miller's fantasies, this alchemical drama unfolds naturally. Her psyche, without conscious knowledge of alchemy, creates the same symbols. It is as though the ancient wisdom of humanity still lives deep within her unconscious and speaks again through her visions. One scene in particular reveals this truth. She dreams of a marriage, but it is no ordinary wedding. It takes place in a sacred setting, filled with symbols of light and fire. The bride and groom in her vision do not simply represent individuals. They represent polarities of the psyche, the conscious and the unconscious, the masculine and the feminine, spirit and matter. Their union is a symbol of integration. Through this inner marriage, the psyche moves closer to wholeness. Jung explains that such fantasies reveal the natural movement of individuation. For individuation is not merely a path of suffering, it is also a path of renewal. After the descent into shadow, after the trials and confrontations, there comes a moment when the opposites, instead of tearing the soul apart, begin to weave themselves into a greater unity. It is here that rebirth occurs. It is here that a new self begins to take shape. Sometimes Miss Miller's visions take the form of cosmic cycles. She imagines suns that die, and suns that are born again. These images echo the myths of the world, the eternal return of light, the rising of dawn after night, the resurrection after death. They also mirror the rhythm of nature itself. The seed falls into the earth, disappears in darkness, only to sprout and grow again in spring. Thus her fantasies remind us that human transformation follows the same law as nature. Death and life are inseparable. Loss and renewal are two sides of the same mystery. Jung points out that such fantasies carry a healing function. They provide the psyche with symbols of hope, images that assure the soul that suffering is not the final word. Even in the darkest visions of Miss Miller, there is always a seed of light, a spark of renewal. The unconscious, it seems, knows the path forward, even when the conscious ego feels lost. One of the deeper lessons of these fantasies is that transformation does not erase opposites. It unites them. Wholeness is not reached by choosing light over dark, or spirit over matter. It is reached by allowing both to coexist, to balance, to complement one another. The true self, the deeper center of the psyche, embraces all opposites, and out of their tension, creates harmony. And so, by the time we reach this stage of her journey, we see the great arc of her inner story, the descent into shadow, the trials of the hero, the encounter with death. All have led to this point of renewal. Through sacrifice, through struggle, a new wholeness is emerging within her. Her fantasies, far from being mere illusions, are revelations of a deeper truth that every soul carries within itself. The possibility of transformation. As the inner drama of Miss Miller deepens, another presence begins to emerge. It is subtle, yet unmistakable. A center that holds together all the scattered images, all the struggles of opposites, all the cycles of death and renewal. Jung names this presence the self. The self is not the ego, not the conscious personality we normally identify with. It is something larger. The totality of the psyche, the center and circumference of the soul. Through her fantasies, Miss Miller begins to touch this deeper reality. At first it appears in symbolic form, as guiding figures, as sacred unions, as images of cosmic wholeness. Each vision, Jung suggests, is like a fragment of a larger picture. Piece by piece, the unconscious is pointing toward the self, toward the hidden center that unites all opposites. One of her fantasies, for example, presents her with a radiant circle, a shining mandala, a symbol of order, balance, and completion. Jung pays careful attention to this, for throughout history, circles, mandalas, and spheres have represented the self, the image of totality in symbolic form. It is as though the psyche, in its own symbolic language, is sketching a portrait of the soul's true center. The self, Jung explains, is not something we invent. It arises spontaneously, out of the depths of the unconscious. It speaks through dreams, through visions, through fantasies like those of Miss Miller. And its goal is always the same, to guide the conscious personality toward greater wholeness. But the path to the self is not easy. It demands sacrifice of the ego, the willingness to let go of narrow self-identifications, to endure the tension of opposites, to pass through death and rebirth. Miss Miller's inner journey illustrates this truth. Her fantasies are not random daydreams. They are stages in the psyche's pilgrimage toward its own center. Sometimes the self appears in her visions as a divine child, a new life, fragile yet radiant. This child is not literal. It is symbolic of renewal, of a new personality being born within her. In many myths, the birth of the divine child marks the dawn of a new era. So too in the psyche, the appearance of this symbol marks the possibility of transformation. At other times, the self takes the form of a wise figure, a guide who seems to know the way forward. This figure is not separate from her. It is her own deeper nature, revealing itself in symbolic form. Jung reminds us that the self can appear in countless disguises, as child, as wise old man, as goddess, as mandala, as unifying light. But behind every image lies the same reality, the totality of the soul, seeking expression. The more we reflect on Miss Miller's fantasies, the clearer it becomes that her unconscious is leading her toward integration. Her struggles with opposites, her encounters with death and rebirth, her visions of sacred marriage and renewal, all point toward the same center. That center is the self. Jung emphasizes that individuation, the process revealed in Miss Miller's case, is ultimately the path toward the self. It is not about perfection, nor about escaping the world, but about becoming whole. To be whole means to embrace the opposites within us, to integrate shadow and light, masculine and feminine, spirit and matter. It means to discover, at the deepest level, the unity that holds them all together. Thus, by this stage in her fantasies, we see how the unconscious is guiding her, not to madness, not to illusion, but to a deeper truth. Her inner images foreshadow the realization of the self, the archetype of wholeness, the hidden center of the psyche, the eternal image of what we are meant to become. As we arrive at the final stage of Miss Miller's inner journey, a larger picture begins to appear. Her scattered visions, her images of birds and flames, her descents into shadow and her returns into light, her sacred unions, her circles, her divine child. All of these fragments weave together into a single pattern. It is the pattern of transformation. Jung reminds us that what we see in her fantasies is not unique to one individual. It is the drama of the psyche itself, the universal story of the human soul. Every culture has told this story in its own way, through myths of dying and rising gods, through legends of heroes who descend and return, through symbols of sacred marriage and renewal. And here, in the imagination of one young woman, that same story reveals itself once again. Alive, immediate, utterly human. The lesson of the Miller fantasies, Jung says, is that the unconscious is not merely a chaos of forgotten material. It is a living force, a wellspring of meaning. When the unconscious is allowed to speak, it produces images that guide, that challenge, that transform. It leads the soul step by step, through death and rebirth, through tension and reconciliation, toward the goal of wholeness. This goal is not perfection in the outer sense, not worldly success or achievement. It is the realization of the self, the deeper unity that embraces all opposites, the eternal center of the psyche. For Jung, the self is both the path and the destination, the guiding voice and the hidden treasure, the image of wholeness already planted within us. Miss Miller may not have known consciously what her visions meant. To her they may have seemed confusing, overwhelming, even troubling. But Jung shows us that within them lies a profound truth. Her fantasies are not signs of illness. They are signs of life, of the unconscious striving to bring her closer to her own center. This is why Jung gave such importance to her case, not because she was extraordinary in her outer life, but because her inner life revealed the extraordinary depths that belong to every human being. Her visions are a reminder that the soul carries within it the same archetypal patterns that once shaped myths and religions. Even in the quiet life of an ordinary person, the great drama of transformation may rise to the surface. Jung concludes that the Miller fantasies illustrate the movement of individuation. The ego, at first identified with the surface self, is drawn into confrontation with the unconscious, is tested, broken, renewed, until finally it begins to align with the greater self. This is the destiny of the human soul, to become whole, to live not in fragmentation, but in integration. And so, the story of Miss Miller is not simply her story, it is a mirror in which we glimpse our own inner journey. For each of us, in our own way, must face the opposites within, must descend into shadow, must pass through trial and sacrifice, and must open ourselves to renewal. The images may differ, the symbols may change, but the process is the same. Through the Miller fantasies, Jung invites us to remember that the unconscious is not an enemy to be feared, but a partner in the journey of life. Its language is symbolic. Its voice speaks through dreams, through visions, through fantasies. And when we learn to listen, When we allow these images to speak, they lead us step by step into the mystery of our own transformation. Thus, the Miller Fantasies end not in despair, but in revelation. They show us that the soul, in its deepest movement, seeks always the path of wholeness. They remind us that even in darkness, there is light. Even in death, there is renewal. And even in struggle, there is meaning. And so, we come to the end of this long journey. Through Jung's analysis of the Miller Fantasies, Anamnesis, a journey into symbols, into shadow, into renewal, and into the deeper mystery of the human soul. If this story touched you, if it opened a window into the unconscious, or simply made you curious to learn more, I invite you to stay connected. Don't forget to like this video, to subscribe to the channel, and to click the notification bell so you won't miss the next deep dive into Jungian thought, psychology, and the mysteries of the inner world.